Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all in this session for research data management, and I also welcome Dr. Arif Shawn that will give us presentation about the research data management. He's from Qatar National Library. I will leave for him to introduce himself. Thank you and welcome. You can start, Dr. Arif.
Hi, thank you, Nadine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
All right, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Arif Shawn. I am a senior digital curation specialist at the Qatar National Library. So I'm going to talk to you about today about the best practices of research data management, managing the data, the research data that you will be producing in your QNRF funded research projects, including those funded under the NPRP program. And I mean, we did a similar webinar to the one today, about 2 years ago, 2019. So those of you who attended that seminar, webinar, you would find that some of the things I'll be talking about are either similar or the same, because the best practices haven't really changed in the last couple of years during the pandemic. And of course, you may also find that you may already be incorporating the practices that I will be talking about in your research. If that is the case, then please do treat this as a bit of a reassurance of the good work that you're doing. And if that's not the case, then hopefully you'll benefit from some of the things that will be mentioned here, and perhaps you'll find them motivational enough for you to adjust your practices accordingly. But more importantly, there's one of the main goals of this webinar is to sort of introduce you to a couple of new requirements from QNRF that you'll actually have to prepare for and address in due course. And these requirements are related to research data management. So we'll walk you through those as well. And hopefully you'll find this informative enough and to help you prepare for meeting those requirements. So that's essentially what I'm going to talk about. So let's just oops, sorry. So here's some of the things I'd like to cover during the course of this webinar. We'll start by reminding ourselves of the importance of research data as, or either reminding ourselves or learning about, depending on your discipline and perhaps your understanding of the topic. So research data as valuable resources, research resources or scholarly resources in their own right. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the management aspect of it, and then followed by the planning for it. And after that, I'll walk you through the key aspects of this new QNRF requirement, which is essentially, for you to submit a research data management plan from, as if I'm not mistaken, from the current NPRP cycles, and also specific to your funding program, perhaps. And there'll also be a requirement for you to report on the progress that you will have made in executing the plan. So I'll walk you through those two requirements and any sort of associated information about it in that part of this, the webinar. And after that, I'll leave you with some concluding remarks, and hopefully after that we can have a Q&A session and get into any details about any of the aspects, any of the topics that you would like, or answer any questions that you have. So that is essentially the structure of the webinar. So let's get right into it. So first of all, let's talk about research data as a valuable scholarly output, or in other words, first-class sort of citizen in scholarly communication. Now, 20 to 30 years ago, this would have been this very notion would have been probably a bit of a far-fetched, because back anything beyond just the traditional publications wasn't really deemed primary. So anything beyond that would have been sort of deemed secondary in terms of the in scholarly communication, basically in the context of scholarly communication. But as you will be aware, the wider research communities have been increasingly recognizing the importance of research data as as sort of, as publish worthy or shareable resources or research outputs in their own right, rather than just being an adjunct to the traditional publications. Now, before we get into that, let's just try and make sure that we're all on the same page about what we really mean by research data. So, depending on your discipline or the field of your research, the research data may take various shapes or and forms. But in general, it really refers to all the information, regardless of how you're presenting it, whether in a machine readable format or in a human readable way. It's all the information that you would need to support or validate all or any part of your findings, your conclusions that you'll be drawing at the end of your research project. And this ranges from how you've developed your research, how you've developed your experiments, what results you produced, not just the final results, but the interim data results, any decisions you will have made, any observations, any findings. So it's a wide variety of things, but in a nutshell, it's basically what you would need to support the claims that you will be you'll be talking about in your research papers. Or so it's what you need. It's what underpins the research papers. And as I said, it includes all types of information. So if you happen to be in social sciences or digital humanities, research data could be the results of the surveys that you will be undertaking. And if you're in a physical science or sort of computational science, then it could be the computational models that you either use or develop as part of your research project life cycle. And of course, if you happen to be working in geospatial domain or climate science, then it could be the measurement that you take at a particular geographical location and using a certain instrument. So it could be information about all of that, not just the readings that you take, but also how you're taking it and what sort of instruments and equipment that you're using. So all of that together form research data. And now let's talk about why it's important. So as I mentioned that, over the past, I think more than a decade now, there's been increasing awareness of the importance of research data for the number of potential benefits that you could have in both academic and commercial context. And if you were to sort of summarize those, then you would find that good quality research data. So that is the that is the main prerequisite. The good quality research data, if shared or made accessible either in a traditional publishing context or in some way or shape or form, then it could be reused in another research project, whether it's your own research, a continuation of your own research project, or it could be picked up by another group of researcher and then reused in their project, and perhaps to help make new discoveries, help find new knowledge. So that is definitely one of the key benefits of having good quality research data. Another very important benefit is basically that the research data, sharing good quality research data, provides a new way or new avenue, for a researcher to get attribution and citation. And as you will be aware that citation attribution is one of the key, the main currencies in academic context, which is something that helps you further your career or help you meet your KPIs and so on. So this is definitely a new way to get research citation beyond just the traditional publications. And in many cases, and perhaps more importantly, research data is what you need to validate or support the claims, the research claims that you're making, the discoveries that you were talking about in your publications, or conclusions that you may have drawn or you will have drawn from your research project. So this is what you need. The research data is what you need to validate it, not just the final, the raw data in a spreadsheet or another sort of format, but also the surrounding information, the contextual information about how you've actually produced the data, the important decisions you've made at various junctures within your research project lifecycle, interim data results even. So all of that is together would be beneficial or would be useful for validating your research and then perhaps enabling the reproduction of it if necessary. So these are sort of three broad categories or three broad types of benefits that you could potentially get from good quality research data. And here's a few more evidences over the years. So back in 2009, UK Research Council UK conducted a review of the eScience program, and in the report that they published, they termed research data as the new instruments of science. So this is one of the early indicators of the growing importance or value of research data as first-class citizen, if you will. And there's another sort of example, and this is actually one of my favorites. So this talks about the 2009 Climate Gate incident, which is what is often referred to as. But if you remember, in 2009, the emails of a group of very prominent and reputable climate scientists from the University of East Anglia in the UK were hacked into, which sort of led to a number of serious allegations made over the integrity and the quality of or even the authenticity of the research that they had been undertaking. And it was quite serious in nature because the data that they were producing at the time, and they still are, whatever they're producing now, are used for various, weather-related services around the UK, including development of, geospatial policies and so on. So this data was, seemed very crucial and a very integral part of not just, part of the university, but as UK and perhaps, Europe in general. So the allegations, were naturally very serious. But then you'll also remember that which led to a very highly publicized investigations by the UK House of Commons, which eventually sort of cleared all the allegations. But it did but the investigations did sort of underline a very important point, which is the need for good quality research data. Had their research data been available, including all the details about the provenance, the research methodologies, the software they used, then perhaps the allegations or the event wouldn't have probably gained as much traction as it did. So it really underlined the importance of making sure that at the end of your project you've got all your data in good quality, along with rich metadata about how you've conducted your research, information about software tools and so on. So this really kind of underlines the importance of research data and having really looking after your research data more than you would probably look after your publications and so on. And sort of 4 years later, just to kind of further emphasize the importance of research data, one of the more most prestigious journals in the world, Nature, opened up a new branch to enable research to publish their research data. They wouldn't need to publish a full paper or anything. They would just be able to publish their research data, of course, in accordance with their, the journal's structure and metadata requirements. But this would then, enable them to get the same type of attribution and citation that they would get from a traditional publication. So this is sort of, another kind of very important indicator of the growing importance of research data. And more recently, as you may be aware, that the Research Data Alliance, along with a number of its initiatives, including Plan S, have been making quite a headway in sort of enabling more openness of research data, sharing research data in a more open way, and that's sort of another sort of indicator and a sort of an evidence of the fact that the wider research community are really sort of taking it seriously, and there's a lot more effort going into the management of the research data, looking after it well, so that you have, you end up having good quality research data at the end of your project. Okay, so hopefully that's giving you a clear enough picture of the the growth that research data as the concept of treating research data as valuable research outputs has been over the past decade or so. Now let's try and understand what you would need to do to ensure that you've got good quality research data at the end of your research project? And the answer to that question is you need to manage it well. So, to ensure that you have good quality research data and thereby, having the potential to, yield these 3 different types of benefits that I've talked about, you need to manage your data well. And that, and if you unpack the notion of managing research data, you'll find yourself, planning for it, and then sort of, adding value to it, which is what often referred to as curation of it. So curating the data so that it adds value throughout the life cycle of the research project. It could be, an example of that could be that you get data from an existing source. You plan to use data from a third-party source. Then you bring it into your research workflow, where you improve the quality of it, whether you adjust the structure or you add more parameters or things like that. So you curate the data throughout the life cycle of your project. And then once you've got your final results, or perhaps even along with your interim data results and so on, you store it. But you do more than that. You preserve it. I mean, I'll try and unpack some of these terms, including curation, preservation, after a few slides. But the point of it is that you need to manage it well to ensure that you've got good quality good quality research data at the end of your research project. And this is something that has to happen throughout the life cycle of a research project. So let's try and understand the life cycle of the research data in the context of a research project. So depending on the discipline that you're from, or perhaps the field of research, you probably start off with either getting data from an existing source, or you create your own data and then you process it. This is where you probably add some of the value, do some of the value added steps in increasing the quality of the data, perhaps. And then you apply your research models or computation models or your methodologies, depending on a discipline once again, and then you arrive at your final data result that you store in some cases for posterity. And this is where the notion of preservation comes into play. As I said, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. But then let's just say you've done all of that, then you make the data accessible in accordance with whatever legal or ethical considerations that you have to take into account. And we'll talk more about the legal and ethical considerations of the data a bit later. But once you've made it accessible, then it has the potential to be reused. Perhaps you're reusing it in your own project. So perhaps you use that to get more funding from QNRF and you use it in a new project. And the cycle continues. And if you sort of look at data at these various stages, then you'll find that there are 3 or 4 different types of data that you're dealing with. So you've got the raw data at the very beginning, if that is appropriate to your research workflow, or you create data and then you basically process it, then you end up with processed data. Then you analyze it, applying your computation models that either you develop or you use it from the community, and eventually you end up with you arrive at your final data results. So your data sort of goes through 3 to 4 sort of different stages, and you have to manage your data at every single sort of stage. And that is the point of that. It's basically research data management is not something that you do as a one-off at the beginning of the project or maybe at the end of it. It's a series of continuous activities throughout the life cycle of your project, and perhaps it's in some cases it's even beyond the life cycle of your project to ensure that your data remains accessible and reusable over the long term. So in order to achieve that, one of the key aspects or one of the key things that you need to do is to plan it well. And in fact, it applies to sort of any aspects of your life. So if you plan something well, then you have a better chance of achieving it. And there's a quote for you. Hopefully you will find it motivational. It says, "For each minute of planning at the beginning of a project, you'll save 10 minutes of headache later." I'm not sure if 10 minutes is scientifically proven, but it kind of drives the point home that you should You should plan your project well, including the data management part of it, so that you basically end up, you have a better chance of having good quality research data. Now, let's just say you've managed your data to the best of your ability, but how do you know that you managed it well? How do you know that you've got good quality metadata? Good quality research data. And there are a few ways you can assess the quality of your research data. And one such way would be the use of the FAIR data principles. Once again, these principles have gained a lot of traction in the past few years. It's becoming increasingly prevalent. So what these principles really tell you, it provides, in fact, they provide you with a set of tools, or rather a set of attributes against which you can assess the quality of your data. The first of which is findable. So it really asks the question: is your data findable? Can other people find your data? And if you unpack it, you'll find that you probably need an identifier for your data, which is a no-brainer, and the identifier should be unique and persistent. And once people found it, then would they understand what it is? So you probably need to describe your data in a granular way, with as much detail as possible. And when we're talking about finding things in today's context, it's most likely to be on the web. It's most likely to be using web-based technologies. So can your data be discovered through the web? So let's just say your data is now findable, so people can find your data, or another researcher can find your data. Once they found their data, can they access it? Do they understand any access conditions that may be governing its access and reuse? And this is where you really need to think about any legal or sort of ethical constraints associated with making your data accessible or sharing your data with anybody beyond your research group, perhaps. And in many cases, in the cases of many QNR-funded projects, especially those with potential commercial prospects, you would find yourselves in a situation that you need to have some kind of an embargo period enforced on the data before you can actually be made accessible to a wider audience. So these are things you have to think about. But from a user point of view, they need to understand that they need to understand these conditions before they can actually begin to access your data or think about accessing your data. Let's just say somehow you've made your data accessible. It's findable. People have found your data. They can access it in accordance with your access conditions. Now, can they really use it within their research workflows, or their systems or their tools? So, are your data interoperable with the research workflows or the methodologies of another research group, for example? And this is where you need to think about, using, formats, data formats, or file formats, or vocabularies that are widely used, not something that you've just developed as part of your research group or within a smaller community, but also something that could be used, widely. An example would be that, if you happen to be in the climate science domain, then you'd probably use NetCDF to describe your data, and then you'd probably use XML to describe the associated metadata, because the interoperability applies to both the actual data and also the surrounding information, the contextual information that you use to describe your data. And finally, let's just say, another group of researchers have found your data, they've accessed it, they even incorporated it into or somehow plugged it into their own research workflow. But would they now know how to actually reuse it? Is there enough information to help them understand how they could just, they could not just sort of use it, but also to sort of use it in a way that would help them find new information? Would they be able to adjust your research, the parameters of your research methods, to find newer things? And would they be able to do it in a way that's machine readable? And what are the legal aspects of that? So perhaps there is a specific licensing attached to this your data, or applies to your data, that even though another group of researchers can find your data, access it, and perhaps read it, but they couldn't really use it in their research project. Perhaps it's something specific to their funding program, so perhaps they couldn't possibly use it in their. So is that information clear to beyond just your own research group? So this is how you would basically go about assessing the quality of the data, under these four different properties. As I've mentioned, that these are increasingly used by the wider research community. And if you want to find out more about those, you can just Google fair data principles. There's like a plethora of information about these, including more detailed use cases and so on. So hopefully now that we've understood the importance of the research data, we've talked about the management of it, and how to and also how to assess how well we've managed data, i.e. whether we've produced good quality data or not. But let's just try and think about what happens if you don't do any of this. Let's just say we completely ignore all of that. Then what could possibly happen? What are the consequences of not managing your data well? And some of these things are, I'm sure would be obvious to you. You're already aware of it. Let's just consider a very drastic, scenario in which you find yourselves just before you have to submit your final report to QNRF, that the couple of PhD students that you had working on your projects have now left the country due to whatever reasons and they had the data on their hard drives and it's nowhere to be found. So you've lost your data. And one of the requirements, very important requirements of QNRF, is to provide evidence of the fact that you've stored your data in a trusted repository. And if you don't have the data, then you can't do that. So as you can imagine, the potential consequences of that is that, perhaps you would lead to, loss of funding or partial funding, and perhaps you'd also jeopardize your future opportunities of getting funding from QNRF. So you can understand that the consequences sort of range from loss of funding to even something as serious as loss of reputation, both personal and institutional. So looking after your data is a serious matter, because if you don't do it well, then there are definitely serious consequences to be faced. So it should be in your interest to sort of to think about this and perhaps do the best you can do in terms of management data well. So that's pretty much what So that's essentially an overview of the importance of the data, research data. An overview of how to manage it and how to assess the quality of that. And of course, we understand what happens if you don't do that. So let's now talk about the planning aspect of it. We mentioned that the planning is the key. And in fact, that's how the notion of research data management plan, or it's often referred to as RDMP, or even shorter version of is DMP, was sort of conceived. So what we're really talking about is a document where you you sort of record how you're going to do the data management, and it's a living document, which we'll come into that in a minute. But it's something it's where you start your initial thoughts, and then you later on, as you execute or implement your plan, you also update it accordingly. So in general, if you look at a good research data management plan, and you should expect to see a range of information, including information about the data, how we actually, what sort of data you're going to be you'll be dealing with, whether it's something of your own, you create from scratch, or you get it from a third-party source or an external source. And it also talks about what sort of research methodology you're going to be using. Whether you will be developing new tools, where you're going to be storing your data, from both during the life cycle and sort of the post-project as well. And in some cases, more importantly, it helps you think about some of the ethical and legal considerations of the data. If your data includes information of sensitive nature, or data involves human or animal participants and so on. So the idea is that this plan helps you think about all of these things at a very early stage, so that you're better prepared for it when there's a conversation to be had with a relevant stakeholder, including your IT department, as well as your funding body. So if you're thinking about this from an early stage, then you're better prepared for it. So that is one of the goals. But these are the sort of the types of information that you should expect to see in a research data management plan. But beyond that, I think beyond that, one of the wider goals of research data management plan is to sort of help change your perspective from being a data producer to being a data reuser. Because let's be honest, if you're a very experienced researcher, you've been in the game for quite some time, you're a lead researcher, you're probably juggling with multiple research projects. So you really don't probably have the time to think about, okay, I'm sort of working towards finding an answer to this very important research question, but how other researchers will be using using the research data or all the findings or the discoveries that I'll be making at the end of the project. So it kind of helps you change your perspective slightly from perhaps thinking about just storing the data somewhere to something more long term, archival and preservation and so on. It helps you think think beyond just enabling the discovery of the data, but it also makes you think about how people will be accessing it and so on. So it's sort of your perspective sort of changes from storing the data to archiving the data, from archiving the data to finding the data, from finding to finding the data to making accessible and so on. So the main point is that if you're having to plan for your data management, and if you're thinking about all these different aspects of the data, then there's a good chance that you'll be thinking about how your data will be used by other people, and that should hopefully motivate you enough to take an extra care of the data that you'll be producing or are producing as part of your research project. So that is one of the wider goals of a research data management plan. And as I mentioned before, it's a living document. It's not something that you do one-off at the beginning of the project. It's something that you often come back to, because at the beginning of the project, you may not have all the information, it may not have all the inputs, all the resources, and it may not have thought of all the challenges that you end up facing during the course of your research project. So once you have more information, once you've perhaps undertaken part of your research, you will have a clear idea as to how to move forward, and which may often involve changing the course of your action. So you come back and you update your research data management plan accordingly. And in fact, it may well serve as a valuable source of information when it comes to preparing for your final data result. In fact, in many countries, including US and Australia and the UK, a lot of institutions provide their researchers with a platform or web-based platforms whereby they can not only manage their data, but also sort of use that information to prepare the final data results. So it should be in your interest to keep this document up to date and as accurate as possible. All right, so moving on. So as I mentioned, that there's a growing there's growing recognition of the importance of research data management, research data, the management of it, or the planning of it within the wider research community, and that resonated that has been resonating with the funding bodies around the world for the last few. I think it's been for the past, if I'm not mistaken, at least for 10 years now. The major funding bodies in the UK, Australia, and in USA, in America, that have been mandating the need for a research data management plan as part of the funding application. So in any of these countries, if you're applying for a fund from any of the major funding bodies there, you would need to provide a data management plan. That is mandatory. I'm not entirely sure if it's mandatory in Australia, but it's definitely in the US and in the UK. The major funding bodies now have mandatory requirements for applicants to submit a research data management plan. QNRF, as the principal funding body in Qatar, recognizes that as well, and in line with these funding bodies, and the practices of these funding bodies in other countries, QNRF have been working very closely with Qatar National Research Library, Qatar National Library for the past few years, in fact, since 2017. And some of you will remember that QNRF signed an MOU with Qatar National Library back in 2017 for the very reason to work together to find solutions to the research data management problems that exist or the challenges that exist in the country. And one of the key outputs or the outcomes of this collaboration was the data management plan policy that was published back in 2019. And this is something we introduced during the 2019 edition of this webinar. Some of you will remember that. But more recently, QNRF, in collaboration with the QNL, have introduced a number of new things, two of which are actually requirements for the future NPRP and perhaps the current and the future NPRP programs. So these are the requirements that you actually have to meet as part of QNRF funded research project life cycles. So just to kind of make you aware where things are. So if I could quickly get out of the presentation and go to bear with me a moment. My mouse is not working. So if you just, Google QNRF data management plan or any combination of that, the first link that you will find will be the data management plan policy that was published by QNRF in collaboration with QNL back in 2019. But there are three new things, as I mentioned, should also appear on that page. And one of which is the data management plan, which is something you have to submit as part of your as part of QNRF requirement. The timing of which will be communicated to you by the QNRF research team in due course. I'm not going to get into that, but there's also an expectation of you to actually provide a report on the progress that you will have made on the plan, on the execution of the planning. So first you talk about the plan, and then later on you have to provide a report on the progress that you will have made. So this is once again, this is in line with what I said before. The planning is not a one-off. It's something that you do as a series of continuous activities. So the new new requirements of QNRF is designed to sort of motivate you to sort of follow that, to sort of adapt that concept within your research project lifecycle. Okay, so back to the presentation here. So what I'd like to do now is to sort of walk you through the main topics or the main categories of the information or the questions that you have to answer in the QNRF data management plan template. So if you open a link, you will find that there's like 4 groups of questions that you have to provide answers to. The first of which is data collection and documentation. So what this talks about is basically 3 things. First, it asks you to describe your data, or what makes you kind of think about different aspects of your data at a very early stage. So, it asks you to think about whether you're going to be using an existing data or some existing source, how you're going to be structuring your data, what kind of, coverage, temporal or geographical coverage, and so on. And even sort of, how if you're going to be versioning your data, how you're going to be versioning your data. And as I mentioned on that page, there is actually another document called the Research Data Management Guidelines. So there's a lot of information about, how you should do, how you should describe your data, or what to do when sort of the best practices for describing your data well are actually in that document. So that document, Research Data Management Guidelines, are sort of essentially an assortment of all the best practices related to data management that you can find on the web. But this is to sort of help you save the trouble of rummaging through the web and sort of putting everything in one place, so you can find information that is very pertinent to your QNRF funded projects. So these questions are related to your data. So you're basically being asked to describe your data to the best of your ability. Once again, this will be very early on in your project, so it's understood and it's and accepted that you may not have all the information. So it's fine if you don't have all the information, but do try and think about some of these questions and provide provide answers to the best of your ability, basically. So that is the intended purpose of this requirement. So next sort of subsection within this category is it's your workflow, your research methodology. So it asks you a question about how you're actually going to do the work. What kind of methodology are you going to be using? Are you going to be developing something from scratch, or are you going to be using a very well-established research workflow from the wider, designated community? So also once again, the guidelines, some of the best practices around it, including references to external resources, can be found in this research data management plan guidelines that was produced in collaboration with Qatar National Library. And the final set of questions related to data collection documentation are about the metadata, which essentially, as I have tried to establish, is essentially the most important part of your research data research data set, because that's essentially the contextual information about your data, including how you're doing how you're conducting the research. What sort of parameters are you using in your methodologies? What models are you using? Where you're getting the data. So it's essentially the metadata. All types of descriptive information that you can think of, which would then enable somebody else to make sense of the data that you're producing. And these questions are asking to think about how you're going to capture that kind of information. Whether you're going to be using a metadata standard. So it may well be the case that your community has uses very well-established metadata standards for it, and you may be using the same. So this question is asking to think about that and actually mention that or outline that in this planning template. Once again, the guidelines and further information about what are the things to consider when it comes to the metadata about your research data are available in these guidelines that you can take a look at that. But the wider objective of these questions is basically, just to kind of further reiterate, is to kind of help you think about the importance of documentation, because you're the expert in your research projects, so everything sort of makes sense to you. So you're sort of going at a very rapid pace and you're making really good progress. But is what you're going to be producing going to be meaningful to another researcher, for example, perhaps who's not as experienced as yourself, perhaps who's from a different domain, who's undertaking a cross-disciplinary research project. So the idea is that if you document it well and if you document it sufficiently, then it will help such a user understand your research better. So the idea is that what's obvious now, and also not just current users, the future generations of users, because at the end of the day, that is the ultimate goal, right? So you're trying to find answers to research questions and thereby finding solutions to the problems that we are facing today. But how is that problem going to manifest itself in 20, 25 years times? How the solution that you're developing today would be applicable in future? Would it need to be adjusted in somehow? So if that is the case, then that future generations of users would need to understand how you develop the solution in the first place. So so basically what's obvious to you right now might not be obvious in months, years, or decades due to changes to the surrounding parameters and the context and technologies and so on. So that is one of the one of the kind of the underlying messages here, that you document it well, so other people can have better chance of understanding it. The same information, detail your methods well enough, and also when it comes to the ability to reproduce your work, detailed documentation definitely helps. So if you detail, if you have enough metadata about how you've done your research, then somebody else can actually reproduce it, and so on. And there are different mantras when it comes to documentation. I'm pretty sure some of you some of these you're already incorporating in your research. The first one is pretty much it's a very obvious one, is that when it comes to documenting it, you make sure it's clear, it's accurate, it's consistent, and so on. And it applies to any type of documentation. In fact, the final report that you will be writing for QNRF, you have when you write it, you have to adhere to a certain structure that has been imposed upon you by QNRF. Of course, you have to provide accurate information, because QNRF will be verifying that information. and you have to be as detailed as part QNRF requirement. So this really applies to anything that you do in your research project life cycle, and perhaps even beyond in other research projects as well. But I think what I find sort of most useful by looking at these types of mantras is basically it basically tells you to do something more than what you're already doing, and which could be that you're doing nothing, so you're doing something more. So it kind of I find it motivational to help me improve upon any of the practices that I'm doing, especially any practice related documentation. So if I'm doing maybe 10%, perhaps this should help me. This should motivate me to do 15%. So it's better good enough than doing nothing at all. So that's essentially the key message here. All right, let's take a look at the second. Oops, sorry. Okay. Anyway, so the second group, or the second category of questions that you have to answer. Is that the second? Yes, that is the second. The second category of questions that you have to answer in the QNRF Research Data Management Plan template, and that's about ethical and legal considerations. So, and if you've been doing QNRF projects for a while, then you'll understand that this ranges from the basic questions of data ownership to how to deal with data that involves human participants, or the data that contains information of sensitive nature, and things like that. So and also it also asks questions about licensing. How the data will be licensed for reuse. If you'll recall, one of the criteria, one of the principles of fair data is data reuse. So if you have a certain license that needs to be considered, then this is where you think about that basically. And just as you know that the IDKT manages all aspects of IPR generated QNRF funded projects, so you will get guidance and instructions or directions from them. So these questions really sort of help you think about the different ethical and legal considerations depending on the type of data that you're dealing with, and it also ties quite closely into the accessibility aspect of your data as well, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But that's basically the set of questions that you have to answer in the second category of the questions in the QNRF Research Data Management Plan template. And once again, as since this will be very early on in your project, you may not have all the answers to the questions, and it's okay to say that this is something I haven't thought about, or this is something that I need further information, or this is something that I will deal with at a later stage, or something along those lines. So, but this is basically intended to help you think about those as early as possible. All right, so moving on to the next group. That's what we're supposed to do. So there's the next category of questions about sharing your data and then storing it and preserving it. So okay, let's unpack that. So the sharing is data sharing is the type of data sharing that you have to deal with depend on your research group and your relationship with any external stakeholders, if applicable. So it's asking a question about who you're going to share the data with. So will it be somebody beyond outside your research group? In many cases, you'll be sharing the data with your it could be, since you'll be storing the data on your institutional data storage or infrastructure, so the data may be accessible to your IT department, for example. But beyond that, it would be about so if you happen to have any sort of part-time students working on your project. Would they have access to your data? If so, and if your data happen to contain sensitive information, would it be legally acceptable for them to access your data? And these sort of questions get a little bit more complicated when when you have external collaborators. So collaborators from another institution, perhaps even perhaps an overseas institution. So how do you ensure that any information that any part of your data that any sensitive parts of your data that they are not allowed to access remain inaccessible to them? So these are things you have to think about, and it also helps you think about the software, the tools, or the technical infrastructure that you may need to adhere to different legal and ethical considerations. So some of these things, some of the data sharing sort of steps that you'll be taking will be heavily influenced by the legal and ethical sort of requirements. So this is they kind of they're closely tied together. And the same thing about the security. So it's also related to data access and sharing. So what kind of access control constraints you would need, any access conditions, and some of these are applicable to the data even after you've completed your data, so your research project. So you've completed your research project, now you're ready to perhaps share or publish your data in line, in accordance with QNRF guidelines and requirements, of course. And once you're ready to do that, how would the access conditions come into play? So this helps you think about all these things at a very early stage, so you're better prepared for it. And you can find best practices around these aspects of data management in the guidelines, which also has reference to other resources and so on. Okay, so in order to enable access, share your data, or enable access to your data, you need to store it someplace. I mean, that goes without saying. You need to store your data at somewhere. And there are some really key questions to consider when it comes to data storage. Not only just to think about whether you will have sufficient storage, but also to think about should you need storage for all the data you produce? Are all the data valuable? And this is where a distinction between active and active data and final data result needs to be taken into account. So the active data is basically what data that you're producing during your research project lifecycle. Something and not all of that may be important to paint a clear picture of the research that you've done. And it varies between disciplines, of course. But in some disciplines, it may be important to keep all the data. In fact, even the inconclusive results, the incorrect interim results may be as equally important as the final data set. Perhaps for providing a clear account of the research that you've undertaken. So you really need to be strategic about what to keep and what not to keep, both during the project and also after the project. And when we're talking about after the project, sorry, this is just a slide about if you don't think about storage, then there's a lot of horror stories about data being lost and so on. But I suppose when with the advent of the cloud infrastructure and technologies such as Dropbox and Google Drives at your disposal, this may not be the case, and these are not very frequent as they used to be, at least. But there's also other considerations to be made. If you lose your data, as I mentioned before, there are serious consequences to consider. Anyway, so beyond your project life cycle, so once you've completed your project, so let's just say you managed your storage well during the life cycle of your project, but now the project is completed, the funding is no longer available. So then you need to think about where you will keep the data for the long term, for the posterity, for the future generations of users. And this is where you have to think about the distinction between just keeping the data someplace and actually preserving it. So because there are fundamental differences between data backup and digital, preserving the data or digital preservation. Because the digital preservation is not something, it's not just about keeping the data someplace, even on the cloud or somewhere. It's a series of continuous activities or activities or operations. Sometimes they are preemptive, sometimes they're reactive, that ensure that your data, along with the metadata that describe it, remain discoverable, accessible, and usable on a computer technology that's available to the generation of user that is actually accessing it. So if your data happens to be discovered and accessed by a future generation of users, they should be able to access your data and render it, use it on the computer technology that would be available to them, which may be far more advanced than the technologies that we have at our disposal now. So just keeping the data somewhere safe doesn't guarantee that, and that's where the notion of digital preservation sort of comes into play. A classic example would be if you're a seasoned researcher who's been in the game for 20 to 25 years, you must have done you would have done your PhD thesis back in, I don't know, 1995, for example, and you probably used WordPerfect to write your thesis. And let's just say you kept your PhD thesis very well. Initially, it was on some kind of floppy disk, then you moved it. You did the due diligence, and you moved it from one place to another. From the floppy disk, it made its way to an external hard drive. Now it's somewhere in the Google Google Drive or even Dropbox, for example. Would you be able to open it using the current version of Microsoft Office, for example? Even if you can open it, would all the fancy diagrams or very well thought out illustrations of the points that you were trying to make be rendered correctly? There's a very good chance that it won't. But if you have preserved your data, which would have mean that you would have perhaps migrated your thesis from not just copying from one place to another, perhaps migration usually means that you're either recreating the same information in a new technology, or you're migrating the underlying file format from one version to another. If you've been doing that, then you probably would have had a better chance of reading your thesis today using the contemporary word processing software. So that's just an example of the need for digital preservation. And I mentioned that there's cloud-based technologies that are available to you sometimes at a very affordable rate. But you also have to think that we also have to be strategic about choosing or opting for one of these solutions, because not all of them may be right for your project. And there, if you look at these cloud-based solutions, and you think about how trustworthy they are, there are different attributes to consider there. So you can find there's all-purpose repositories or storage solutions that are out there, including Harvard's Dataverse. There's Data Hub now, Zenodo, which is very popular with the researchers. But then you'll also find very discipline-specific solutions such as Nomad for material science. There's also institutional repositories, and these are often preferred to your typical Dropbox or Google Drive, for example, because a storage solution like Dropbox or Google Drive doesn't quite guarantee preservation, and there may be some legal considerations to be taken into account as well. So, for instance, if your project has or your funding body has a strict requirement for the data that you produce as part of your research project, not to go beyond just say the geographical boundary of Qatar, then if you put this in Dropbox, for instance, it's immediately going out of Qatar, because Dropbox, as far as I know, has no data centers in Qatar. So you'll probably be probably end up somewhere in Western Europe, or even in the US. So you're immediately breaching that sort of legal requirement. So these are some things to take into account when you're choosing storage solutions or you're choosing sort of solutions for storage and preservations. And there are detailed guidelines about these aspects of your research data management in the guidelines document. And once again, you may not have answers to all these questions at the very beginning. So you just put down as much as you can, and you'll have an opportunity to come back to it later on. It's just a slide to kind of illustrate the point of the slow death of data through storage media and formats. So the example of the word perfect is quite pertinent to this. That through rapid technological involvements, the formats are changing at a rapid pace, that it really kind of threatens the longevity of your data. So this is something to think about that. All right, so finally, the final group of the final category of questions that you have to answer is basically, who's going to be doing all that? So, you're the lead researcher, you're juggling with, maybe 4, 5, to 6 projects. But to ensure that all these different aspects of research data management are sort of, addressed and looked after and cared for, who's going to be doing that? So you have to think about that from the very beginning, not just in terms of human resources, but also technical resources. So, maybe you need, especially software, infrastructure, and so on, and which often has costs associated with it. So thinking about these at a very early stage would help you have more productive conversations with, for example, your IT department. So if you at a later stage in the project, if you go talk to your IT department about your storage requirement, you will have already thought through some of the requirements and some of the details. So you would basically be able to just ask for the right things and have a very productive and efficient conversation with them. So that is essentially the purpose of that. So these are the 4 main categories of questions that you have to answer. Once again, I reiterate that you may not have all the information at the very beginning, and you'll have an opportunity to come back to it. Okay, so just quickly, we'll just take a look at an example data management plan, and this is also in the guidelines document in Appendix B. So we'll just quickly go out of the presentation, and we'll just click on the guidelines here. And what you will find that, and this example is by no means representative of your research domain. This is deliberately left quite generic, so you can get a feel for what it would look like, rather than just being being prescriptive about how you should do how you should do a research data management plan for your own discipline. Bear with me a moment. Let me just find it. So it's Appendix B. So it basically asks questions. As I said, the first group of questions is about data collection documentation, and as you can see, some example answers to these questions. In this particular case, the researcher is basically talking about the 2 primary methods for data collection that they will be using. And it doesn't really go into that much details, but it gives you an overview, some summary of what they might be doing, and that is probably sufficient at an early stage, because they'll have the opportunity to later on to come back to it and provide more details. And in the second question, when the researcher is talking about their data collection methodologies, and in this particular case, the researcher has done this many times before, so they are able to go into a lot more detail here. And which may not be the case for your research project if this is a new territory that you're charting. So it's okay to be as detailed as possible for your research domain. And so some examples sort of go on. So in case of metadata, I mentioned that it's important to use a certain standard for the metadata, and in this particular case, the researcher is using Data Documentation Initiative, which is a widely established standard for capturing information about scientific studies. And this once again, this may not be relevant to your community. Your community may be using something else. So it's very much okay to use something else, as long as you're documenting it here and you're using something that's widely adopted, that's adopted beyond just your own research group. And you can find other example answers to other questions if you just go through it. It's on the web. Please take a look. So the purpose of that was just kind of give you a feel for how what some of the answers would look like. Let's go quickly back to the presentations. Okay. So the second requirement of I mentioned that there's 2 new requirements coming from QNRF, and the second of which is basically a progress report on the same types of questions, the same questions that you will have to answer in the planning template. So it's not something new, but it's asking you. So the wording is slightly different because it's asking you to provide an update on what you've done. So during the planning, you're saying this is what you're going to do. Now during the reporting, you're basically reporting on what you've done, and this is where you sort of report on any sort of change of change of plans. If you've changed your course of action due to whatever reason, this is where you talk about it and perhaps you provide justification for it as well. So that is the purpose of this progress report. It's almost sort of identical to the planning template, but it asks you to provide an update what you've done rather than just talking about how you're going to do it. So that is pretty much the two new and kind of a walkthrough of the two new things that are coming from QNRF. So we're nearly at the end of it. So what are the next steps for your project? Of course, you have to prepare and submit your data management plan for review by QNRF, and I think QNL will play a part in there too. It will contribute to this process. The timing of it and the process of it will be communicated to you through the usual channels. And if you have any questions about it, I'll ask Nadine and Wael to talk about those if you have any questions. But the idea is that this should help you prepare, better prepare for managing your data and help you sort of improve the quality of your data, at the end of your research project. And in fact, the final data set that you will have will need to go as part of the QNL requirement will need to be stored in a trusted repository. And to that end, QNRF and QNL have been working together to develop a repository, specifically designed for QNRF funded projects, and it's very, it's been under development. I cannot tell you the time frame right now, but it will be available to you in due course. But when that does become available to you, you will have another trusted repository where you can put the data in. The development is underway. But in addition to that, just like this webinar, there are training and guidelines that are available. QNRF and QNL have put in a lot of effort to put these guidelines together for you. But there's also a personal or face-to-face consultation available if you require, especially on some of the more and legal aspects and so on. So as well. Now, finally, just to kind of remind you of the the important.
Dr. Arif, I don't hear you.
Okay. Hello?
Yes, no, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I lost you there. All right, so we're nearly there. We're nearly at the end. So the key messages are basically, try to look after your data well, more than what you've been doing. So, so hopefully by completing or by creating a plan, even though it's required by QNRF, you'll be able to find usefulness of it, and then hopefully it will change your perspective from being a data producer to data reuser. And as a result, the overall quality of your data will improve, research data will improve at the end of your research project. And just to kind of reiterate the fact that research data management is not something that you do just as a one-off. This is something that you have to be prepared to do over the life cycle of your research project, and sometimes even beyond that, for the purpose of preservation and longevity. And there are some complex areas they have to pay particular attention to, including security, legal issues, and as well. And finally, I know there's a lot more when it comes to doing the work. It kind of adds to your existing workload, and there may be challenges that you face along the way. But there's help at hand as well. There's a help available from both QNL and QNRF. So please do contact us if you have any questions or if you have any need for advice. And that is pretty much it. And there's some links to some of the some of the resources on the web. But you can find all of that in that QNRF research data management guidelines. So all of that is in there. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.